Galactic Council stunned as humanity's war fleet arrived. The Galactic Council had a rule about emergencies. Every species, every delegate, every senior official had to be reachable within 4 minutes of an alert. It was a good rule. It had existed for 200 years. In 200 years, it had never actually been tested, because nothing had ever happened fast enough to require it. The rule was tested on a quiet Tuesday. It started with a single technician in the Deep Range Observation Post, a Charon named Whis who had been assigned to the night monitoring shift for 3 years and had never once seen anything worth reporting. Whis was eating a meal and reading a personal message from her family when every single long-range buoy in Sector 12 sent a signal at the same moment. Not an error ping, not a calibration notice, a contact signal repeated, growing. Whis put down her food and pulled the data onto the main screen and sat there for a full minute trying to find the mistake. There was no mistake. She sent the alert up the chain with shaking hands and then sat back and stared at what the buoys were showing her and thought, quietly and privately, that she was glad she was not the one who had to explain this to the council. Counselor Vale was in the middle of his sleep cycle when the message reached him. He read it once standing next to his bed, and then read it again, because the first reading had not produced a response in his brain that felt appropriate to the content. Then he dressed and went to the chamber, and by the time he arrived, 14 other senior delegates were already there, standing in small clusters, all of them looking at the main display. The display showed contacts, hundreds of them, bright clean contacts, not ghosts, not debris clusters, not the kind of fuzzy multi-returns you got from a comet field. Ships, large ones, moving together in a formation so tight and so precise that the display kept trying to classify them as a single massive object. The origin stamp on every contact read the same thing. Earth. Vale stood in front of the display for a long time without speaking. Around him, the chamber was filling with noise, delegates calling their aides, officials pulling up tactical overlays, the head of council security already arguing with 2 different people at once about response options. The HRAF delegates had moved to the far corner of the room and were standing with their backs almost touching, which was a fear response Vale recognized. The Urathi general, Haas, was at the weapons readiness console with his hand near the activation control. "Do not touch that," said Vale. Haas turned. "These are warships. I can see what they are." "Then you understand that we are looking at an invasion fleet, and the appropriate response is not standing here looking at it." Vale walked to the display and studied the formation pattern. He had spent a long career learning how to read what was not being said as well as what was. The fleet was moving at a speed that would bring it to the station in approximately 9 hours. It was not a combat approach speed. It was not slow enough to be cautious. It was the speed of something that had a destination and had decided to arrive at it. "They are not an attack formation," he said. "Weapons signature." The monitoring officer, a quiet young Sauron named Teal, checked her board. "Weapons present, not charged. Point defense systems are passive." "Communication attempts." "Nothing yet. They are broadcasting on a standard approach frequency, but not transmitting content." Haas said, "A fleet does not need to transmit content. The fleet is the content." Vale thought about that. He thought Haas was not entirely wrong, but he also thought that a species planning an invasion did not generally approach at parade speed in a tight display formation that allowed every sensor on the station to count exactly how many ships they had brought. That was not the behavior of something that wanted to surprise anyone. That was the behavior of something that wanted to be seen. "Send a formal hail," he said. "Standard council greeting protocol." The hail went out. They waited. For 6 minutes the fleet continued its approach, and the channel was empty, and the chamber got very loud with people arguing about what to do when the hail was not answered. Vale stood at the display and watched the contacts and kept his breathing even. Then the channel opened, and the noise in the chamber stopped. The voice was human. It belonged to a woman, and it was the kind of voice that had given a great many orders and received a great many difficult reports, and had learned to stay level through both. It did not sound nervous. It did not sound aggressive. It sounded like someone who had been expecting this call and had been ready for it. Council Station, this is Fleet Admiral Rhea, commanding the Earth Unified Defense Force. We are carrying formal diplomatic credentials and a full membership application under Council Charter Article 9. We request permission to send a delegation aboard. The fleet will hold at a distance of your choosing while talks proceed. The channel stayed open. She was waiting. The chamber was completely still. Vale looked at the display. 430 ships holding their formation, not advancing another meter since the channel opened. He looked at the weapons readiness board. Still passive. He looked at Haas, who was looking at the display with an expression that had moved past anger into something more complicated. He pressed the response key. Admiral Rhea, this is Counselor Vale. We acknowledge your transmission. Please hold current position. We will respond with coordinates and boarding protocols within 30 minutes. He released the key and turned to the chamber. I need the human file, he said. Everything we have. And I need someone to tell me how a level 3 species arrives with 400 warships without us noticing they were building them. Nobody answered that question immediately, which was, Vale thought, probably its own kind of answer. Outside, the fleet held, perfectly still. 430 ships sitting in the dark between stars, patient in the way that things are patient when they have already decided that waiting is not the hard part. On the bridge of the lead human vessel, a junior communications officer named Dira was watching the Council Station sensor sweeps pass over the fleet for the 14th time in the past hour. She could track them on her board as faint pulses, probing, trying to get accurate readings on the fleet's exact capabilities. She marked each sweep in her log without comment. Beside her, the fleet's senior intelligence analyst, a man named Graves who was older than most of the ship's crew combined, was drinking something hot and making notes on a physical pad of paper, which he preferred over screens for reasons he had never fully explained. He had been doing this since they dropped out of FTL. He looked relaxed. He was not relaxed. Dira had worked with him long enough to know the difference. They've swept us 14 times, she said. 16, said Graves without looking up. You missed 2 in the first hour. They were running a secondary array on a different frequency. What are they learning? That we are exactly what we said we are. He turned a page. The Admiral was right to give them the full approach. Nothing creates fear like an unknown. Everything we let them see clearly is one less thing their imagination fills in with something worse. Admiral Rhea was standing at the far end of the bridge looking at a screen that showed the station's position. She had barely moved in the last 2 hours. Her staff knew better than to interrupt her when she was in this mode. The quiet before a thing she had prepared for became a thing she was living through. She turned without being called and said, They accepted the hold request. We are going aboard. The bridge did not cheer. These were not people who cheered easily, but something relaxed in the room, some held breath that nobody had admitted to holding. Dira said quietly to Graves, What if they say no to the membership? Graves looked up at her for the first time. Then we go home, he said simply. We tried the right way. If the right way fails, you do not immediately try the wrong way. You go home and you wait and you try the right way again. Dira thought about that. It seemed like an incomplete answer, but she had learned that incomplete answers from Graves usually meant the complete version required more time than she had. Back on the station, the council was not relaxed. Counselor Vale had called an emergency inner circle session, and the room was full of the specific kind of tension that came from intelligent people facing a problem none of their experience had prepared them for. The analyst team had pulled the human file, and the results were sitting on the table, in a form that nobody wanted to be the first to address out loud. The head analyst, a precise and unhappy Velny named Sot, addressed it. The human species has been filing mandatory development reports for 11 years, she said. Quarterly submissions, as required under Level 3 monitoring protocol. Every submission was received and processed. None were flagged for review because the automated system assigned all Level 3 reports a monitoring priority of low. She pulled up the table. Year by year, ships listed plainly, numbers climbing steadily. Year 1, 12 vessels. Year 2, 31. Year 3, the number jumps to 80 because they completed 2 new orbital construction facilities. She moved through the years. By year 7, they had over 200 ships and were conducting large-scale fleet exercises that they reported in full, including coordinates, duration, and tactical objectives. The room was very quiet. General Haas said, and nobody looked at any of this. The reports were in the queue. The queue had over 40,000 active files from developing species. Priority was assigned by species classification. Humans were Level 3. Who assigned the classification? Sot pulled up the original assessment. The evaluation team from Initial Contact. Their report describes human military capability as significant but internally focused, unlikely to develop meaningful interstellar projection capacity within the next 50 years. Haas stared at the report. That assessment is 11 years old. Yes. And we never updated it. Level 3 assessments are scheduled for review every 25 years. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people realizing that something they had trusted completely had failed completely, and had been failing for a long time without anyone noticing. Vale said, "What else is in the file that we have not read?" Sot hesitated for just a moment. 3 years ago, the humans sent a series of emergency distress notifications. Colony installations in their outer system were under attack by a species called the Dreth. 7 notifications over a period of 40 days, all received, all logged. Response: none was sent. The notifications were categorized under Outer System Conflict Monitoring, which is a passive file. No action trigger was attached to the category. Vale kept his face still. What happened to the colonies? 2 stations were destroyed. 1 was evacuated. The humans then engaged the Dreth militarily. The conflict lasted approximately 19 months. It ended with the Dreth withdrawing from the outer system. The humans filed a complete after-action report, which is also in the low-priority queue. Yes. Haas had stopped looking angry. He was looking at the table now with the expression of a military man doing a calculation he did not like the answer to. They fought a full interstellar war, he said slowly, won it, and filed a report about it, and we did not know. We had the report, said Sot. We did not read it. Vale stood and moved to the window. The human fleet was not visible from here, too far out, but he knew it was there. He knew something else now, too. He had spent the last 2 hours assuming the question was what the humans wanted. He was beginning to understand that the more important question was what they already knew about the Council and whether they had decided to come anyway. A species that had been ignored for 11 years, that had watched its colonies burn while its distress calls sat unread in a folder somewhere, that had fought and won a war alone and filed a polite report about it. That species had then built 400 warships and come to ask for a seat at the table. Not to demand, not to threaten, to ask. Vale thought about what kind of people did that, what kind of patience it required, what kind of belief in something larger than yourself it took to do the right thing by the rules of an institution that had repeatedly failed you, because you thought the institution itself was worth preserving. He turned back to the room. We are going to have a very honest conversation with Admiral Rhea, he said. And before that conversation, I want a full internal report on why those distress notifications were never acted on, every person in the chain, every decision that was not made. He looked at Hoss. Because she already knows. I am certain of it. And walking into that room without knowing what she knows is not a position I intend to be in. The boarding shuttle that came from the human fleet was not what anyone expected. The council had prepared Docking Bay 7, the formal receiving bay with the high ceilings and the ceremonial lighting and the full honor guard formation. They had sent the coordinates. They had opened the approach lane. They had prepared the kind of arrival that the council staged when it wanted to remind a visiting party of its own scale and importance. The shuttle that came through the approach lane was small, functional, the kind of vessel that was built to move people from one place to another without any interest in what it looked like while doing it. It had a few scrapes on the lower hull that had been repaired but not cosmetically finished. It docked without ceremony, and the hatch opened, and Admiral Rhea stepped out. She was alone. No honor guard, no delegation, no row of officers in dress uniforms. Just her in the same working uniform she had been wearing when she sent the first hail, and a single bag over one shoulder. The council's full reception committee stood in the bay looking at her. She looked at them. Then she looked at the ceremonial formation and the decorative banners and the 6 officials in their formal robes, and she said, in a tone that was entirely polite and completely direct, "I appreciate the welcome. Could we skip to the part where we talk?" Counselor Vale stepped forward before anyone else could respond. "Of course, this way." He took her to his personal conference room rather than the formal chamber. He had decided this after the briefing. Formal rooms were for formal performances. He wanted to understand her, and performances got in the way of that. She sat without waiting to be invited. She put the bag on the floor beside her chair and looked at the table and then at him. "You read our file," she said. "It was not a question." "We read it," he said. "Recently and too late, but yes." She nodded slowly. "What did you make of it?" It was a strange question. A visiting dignitary asking a senior counselor what he made of the intelligence she had already provided, as if she was genuinely curious rather than trying to establish position. "I made of it," said Vale carefully, "that your species has been patient in a way that I find difficult to fully understand, and that your patience was not rewarded by this institution in any meaningful way." "No," she said, "it was not. I want to ask you something directly." "Please." "The distress notifications, the colonies. You know we received them and did not respond." "Yes." "And you came here anyway, asking for membership." Rhea was quiet for a moment. She looked at the surface of the table in the way people look at something when they are reaching for the honest version of a thought rather than the easy version. "We have a word on Earth," she said finally. "Scar tissue. It is what forms when a wound heals. It is tougher than normal skin. It does not feel things quite the same way the original skin did." She looked up. "Earth has a lot of scar tissue. We made most of the wounds ourselves over a very long history of doing things wrong and learning from it. We are not naive about institutions failing. We built and destroyed enough of our own to understand that it is not a reason to stop building." "That does not answer why you still came to us specifically, after the colonies." She said, "Because the Dreth did not have a council to belong to. They had no shared rules with us, no common framework, no table we both sat at. And that is why 40 days of attacks became a 19-month war." She let that sit for a moment. "Every month of that war cost us something we cannot get back. If there had been a table, if there had been a place where both species had obligations and a process for disputes, some of that cost might not have been paid." She looked at him steadily. "We are not here because the Council earned it. We are here because the alternative is a galaxy with no table, and we have seen what that looks like up close." Vale thought about the Dreth War. He thought about 19 months and 2 destroyed stations, and a complete after-action report sitting unread in a low-priority queue. He thought about what it cost to believe in something that had failed you. He said, There are members of this council who will argue that your fleet is itself a destabilizing presence, that no developing species should be permitted to accumulate military capacity at this scale without council oversight. Rhea said, they are right that oversight matters. They are not right that it should only apply to developing species. She reached into the bag and took out a data unit and placed it on the table. That is a full proposal for a mutual military transparency framework. Every member species, including Earth, submitting quarterly capacity reports that are actually reviewed by an active monitoring committee with enforcement authority. She paused. We have been filing reports for 11 years that no one read. We are not interested in a system where that is possible in either direction. Vale picked up the data unit. It was heavier than it looked, or perhaps that was just his understanding of what it contained. You prepared this before you came, he said. We have been preparing for this conversation for 3 years, said Rhea. Since the first Dreth attack, we knew then that the question was never whether we would be capable of being here. The question was whether we were ready to do it the right way. And are you? She looked at him with the clear, level expression of someone who had thought about a question for a very long time and arrived somewhere solid. We are ready to try, she said. That is all anyone can honestly promise. Vale set the data unit down. Outside his conference room window the stars were steady and cold and numerous, the same stars they had always been, indifferent to the conversations happening between the small warm things traveling between them. He thought that was either deeply humbling or deeply clarifying, and that on most days it was both. I will present your application to the full council tomorrow, he said. I will present it with my recommendation in favor. Something moved in Rhea's face. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. The expression of a person who has carried a weight for a long time and has just been told they are allowed to set it down for a moment, even if there is still a long road ahead. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me yet, said Vale. General Haas has not spoken. General Haas requested a private meeting with Admiral Rhea, and was surprised when she agreed without conditions. He had expected her to bring staff. He had expected a formal setting with a record being kept. He had expected the kind of careful diplomatic theater that senior officials performed when they wanted a conversation to be on the record, without admitting they wanted it on the record. He had prepared for all of that. She came alone, again. He came alone, too, because it seemed like the thing to do, and because he did not want his staff watching what he intended to say. They met in a small room near the station's outer ring. No windows, a table, 2 chairs. The room smelled faintly of recycled air and old machinery, the kind of smell that meant the room was used for maintenance briefings and nothing important. Haas sat down across from her and looked at her for a moment. She looked back without moving. He said, I am going to speak plainly. I would prefer it, she said. I do not trust you. I do not trust your fleet. I do not trust the timing of this arrival or the presentation of it, the patience, the politeness, the single shuttle and the no-honor guard and the data units with the well-prepared proposals. He watched her face. It is too clean. A species that has just spent 19 months in a war arrives here looking like they spent the same 19 months in a diplomatic academy. That is not natural. Rhea said, what would natural look like to you? Anger, grievance, demands. You lost 2 colony stations and 6,000 people, and you came here with proposals and patience. That is not how species behave after losses like that. She was quiet for a moment. We buried our anger, she said. That is not the same as not having it. He had not expected her to say that. He had expected a denial or a reframe, not that. Explain that to me, he said. She leaned forward slightly. We have a word, grief. It means the pain that follows loss. On Earth we have an old argument about grief. One side says you must express it immediately and completely or it will damage you. The other side says that grief expressed without direction destroys what is around it. She looked at him directly. We are a species that nearly ended itself multiple times because our grief had no direction. We learned to hold it, not to bury it forever. To hold it long enough to ask what direction it should go. Hawes said nothing. The 6,000 people we lost to the Dreth, she said. We held that. We held it through 19 months of war, and we pointed it at the right target, not at the nearest available one. And then we came here. She paused. The anger is real. It is still there, but we decided where it was going before we walked through your door. Hawes studied her face. He had spent 60 years reading people in the specific way that soldiers learn to read people, looking for the gap between the face they presented and the one underneath. He was looking for that gap now. He could not find it. He said, "You know what frightens me most about your fleet?" "Tell me." "It is not the size of it. I have seen larger collective forces when the Council musters for joint operations. It is the discipline." He said the word like it was almost an accusation. 400 ships in FTL formation, perfect spacing, perfect timing, not one vessel out of position. A fleet that disciplined follows orders that precisely. Which means if those orders were ever to change, if the patience you are describing were to run out, that fleet would be equally precise in the other direction. Rhea said yes. He blinked. He had not expected agreement. "You are correct," she said. "A well-trained force is dangerous in any direction. That is exactly why the transparency framework we proposed matters. That is why oversight matters. We are not asking you to trust our intentions alone. We are asking you to build a system where our intentions can be verified." She met his eyes. "We designed the framework with that fear specifically in mind. We know what we are. We have been honest with ourselves about it for a long time." Hawes was quiet. Outside the door, the station went about its business, the hum of systems and the movement of people through corridors, and the faint sounds of a place that existed to keep many different kinds of life in proximity, without the proximity becoming catastrophic. He said, "On my world, when two people who have been enemies decide to stop being enemies, there is a ceremony. Both parties make a cut on their hand and press them together. The idea is that the agreement is not just words. It has a cost. Something real was given." Rhea looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," said Hawes slowly, as if he was arriving at the words as he spoke them rather than retrieving them from somewhere prepared, "that I do not trust proposals and frameworks. I trust cost. I trust what a party is willing to give that is real and irreversible." He looked at her. "What is Earth willing to give that it cannot take back?" The question sat in the room. Rhea reached into the inside pocket of her uniform and took out something small. She set it on the table between them. It was a thin metal tag, the kind used to identify personnel in military service, the kind that survived things the person wearing it did not. "That belonged to a soldier named Wren who died in the second month of the Dreth War," she said. "She was 23. She was one of ours." She looked at the tag on the table. "I have been carrying it since her unit commander gave it to me. I carry it because leaders who stop feeling the cost of their decisions start making worse decisions." She slid it slightly toward him. "I cannot give you something Earth cannot take back. No one can promise that honestly. What I can give you is the truth about what we have already paid, and why we are still here asking instead of taking." Hawes looked at the tag for a long time. He did not pick it up, but he did not look away from it either. "I will not vote in favor," he said finally. "I want you to know that before the session." "I know," said Rhea. "But I will not move to block the vote by procedural motion. If the numbers are there, they are there." He stood. "And I will tell my staff that the transparency framework proposal is worth reading." Rhea picked up the tag and put it back in her pocket. She stood too. "That is enough," she said, "for now." He left first. She stood in the empty room for a moment and looked at the surface of the table and thought about cost, about what it meant, about the 60 years behind the eyes of the man who had just left, and the wars those eyes had seen, and why fear that came from that much experience was not a small thing to ask someone to move past. She did not think he was wrong to be afraid. She thought he was right about exactly the thing that mattered, and that he knew it, even if he was not ready to say so out loud. She picked up her bag and went back to work. While the council voted, a Urathi junior officer named Save was sitting in the station's secondary observation lounge with a human she had not intended to speak to. His name was Dira, and he was part of the communications team from the human fleet, assigned to the station during the diplomatic proceedings to maintain the link between the delegation and the ships waiting outside. He was young, maybe 30 by human years, which Save understood was quite young for them, and he had been sitting at the lounge window for 2 hours watching the star field with an expression that was hard to read. Save had sat down at the far end of the lounge to review notes. She had not planned to talk to him. She was aware that her general, Haas, was opposed to the membership, and she was aware that talking casually with a human crew member during an active vote might be seen as a statement she was not intending to make. But he had a cup of something, and she could smell it from 3 seats away, and it was the strangest smell she had encountered in her 6 years of station duty. She said before she could decide not to, "What is that?" He turned and looked at her and then at the cup. "Coffee." "What does it do?" "Makes me feel like I can think." He paused. "Or like I should be thinking. The difference gets blurry around the 3rd cup." She moved 1 seat closer without meaning to. "Is it the 3rd cup?" He looked at the cup. "4th." She said, "Is that healthy?" "Probably not." He looked back out the window. "But we are sitting here waiting to find out if the thing we spent 11 years working toward is going to be decided by a vote we had no say in, so the normal rules feel less relevant." Save sat with that for a moment. She was a junior officer and her opinion on the vote did not matter, and she had tried very hard not to form one because forming opinions that differed from your commanding general was a complicated position to be in. But she had been on the station for 3 days, and she had watched the human delegation, and she had read the internal briefings, and she had a mind that would not stop working regardless of what she told it. "What does it feel like?" she said. 11 years of building toward one thing." He looked at her. He did not seem suspicious of the question. He seemed like someone who had been asked the thing he most wanted to talk about. "Like you are always holding 2 ideas at the same time," he said. "One is that it might work. The other is that it might not, and all of it will have been for nothing. You have to hold both, or you go wrong in one direction or the other. If you only hold the first one, you stop being careful. If you only hold the second one, you stop entirely. Which one is harder to hold?" He thought about it. "The first one," he said. "Hope is heavier than doubt. Doubt just sits there. Hope has to be fed." Save looked at the cup in his hands. She thought that was the most unexpectedly honest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. She thought about what it meant that a species capable of building 400 warships was also capable of producing a person who talked like this about hope. She said, "My general does not trust your fleet." "I know," said Dira. "He is not wrong to think about it carefully." "You are not angry about that." "I understand it. A new powerful thing arrives and you cannot verify its intentions from the outside. The only rational response is to be cautious." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "What I hope he sees eventually is that we built the fleet for the same reason he wants to be cautious about it. Because the galaxy is large and things happen in it, and the option of being unprotected was not acceptable to us." He paused. "We just decided that being protected and being isolated were not the same thing." Before Save could answer, her communicator signaled. The vote was complete. She looked at Dira. He had gone very still. The signal resolved into text rather than a voice announcement, which was protocol for votes during active diplomatic proceedings. She read it: 8 in favor, 4 against, 4 abstaining, passed. She looked at Dira. His eyes were closed, just for a moment. Then he opened them and looked at the star field and breathed out slowly, the way a person does when they have been holding something in for a very long time and have finally been told they can let it go. Save said it passed. I heard, he said. His voice was level, but something in the set of his face had changed. Something had relaxed that she had not known was tense. She realized she had been looking at controlled tension for 3 days without recognizing it because it had been so consistent that she had mistaken it for his normal state. She said, "Congratulations." He looked at her, and for just a second she saw the weight of 11 years in his expression. The building and the waiting and the war and the losses, and the filing of reports that no one read and the coming here anyway and the sitting in this lounge, with a fourth cup of something unhealthy watching a star field and holding both ideas at once. Then he said, "Thank you," and he meant it in a way that was larger than the word. Save thought about what Hoss would say if he knew she had been sitting here. Then she thought about what she actually believed, which she had been avoiding thinking directly for 3 days, and she thought that a species which sent one person to a lounge window with a cup of something terrible, and then described hope as heavier than doubt, was probably not the thing her general was afraid it was. She thought she would write a private report about this conversation, not to anyone's attention, just for herself, for later, when the shape of the thing that had changed today became clearer. She stayed at the window a while longer. Outside, the fleet was still there, patient as it had always been, its running lights steady in the dark. The first thing the Council asked Earth to do, as a full member, was something nobody expected. It was not a military matter. It was not a treaty negotiation or a border question or a trade agreement. It was a cultural exchange request, submitted by a small species called the Eshari, whose home world sat at the outer edge of the Council's territory, and who had been members for 30 years without anyone ever requesting a cultural exchange with them. Councillor Boda of the Eshari had submitted the request quietly, the day after the vote. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She had simply filed it through the new member's first formal request process, which was a procedural tradition allowing any new member to make a single opening request as a gesture of galactic community. Most species used the first request for something practical: trade access, survey rights, communications infrastructure. The practical requests went to the relevant committees and were processed without particular attention. Boda had been watching the humans for 4 days and had submitted a request asking Earth to share the history of how it had ended its last internal war. When the request landed in the delegation's queue, Rhea read it twice. Then she called Dr. Sen. He was already reading it when she called. "Thoughts," she said. "It is the right question," he said. "She is asking how we stop destroying ourselves. She is asking because they have a conflict of their own that has been dragging for 19 years and nobody with power has helped, and she wants to know if there is something in our history that applies." "Can we answer honestly?" "We can only answer honestly," said Sen. "Anything else would be useless." They prepared the response together and it took 2 days. Not because it was complicated to write, but because it was hard to write accurately. The end of Earth's last major internal war was not a clean story. There was no single agreement or heroic moment or obvious turning point. There was a slow exhaustion on all sides and a generation of people who had grown up in the wreckage and decided, without coordination, that they were not willing to keep paying the cost. There were failed ceasefires and broken negotiations and years of fragile progress collapsing and being rebuilt. There were individuals who held things together by refusing to let go and were not remembered by history because history preferred clean stories to true ones. They wrote all of it. The failures and the partial victories and the long middle section where nothing was clear and people kept going anyway. They wrote it in plain language with no attempt to make their species look better than the record showed. When the document was delivered to Boda, she read it alone in her small office and was not seen by her staff for several hours. What she did with it was something no one anticipated. She distributed it to every member of the HFY delegation, and then, through internal channels that moved faster than official processes, it began appearing in briefing materials across the council. Not because anyone had ordered it distributed, because people read it and passed it on. The document had a particular quality that most official council communications did not. It was not trying to do anything other than tell the truth. There was no position being advanced, no outcome being steered toward, no diplomatic framing around the difficult parts. It described a species that had failed repeatedly at the thing it most needed to do, and had kept trying anyway for reasons that were not entirely rational, and had eventually arrived somewhere better through a process that was not clean or heroic, but was real. Haas read it on the third day. He had received it from one of his own staff members who had forwarded it without comment, which was itself a statement from someone who knew their general well enough to know that the absence of recommendation was sometimes its own recommendation. He read it twice. He put it down. He picked it up again an hour later and read the middle section a third time, the part about the generation that grew up in the wreckage and decided without coordination. He thought about that for a long time. He did not change his vote retroactively, because votes could not be changed and he would not have wanted to change it if they could. His caution had been honest, and he did not regret honest positions. But he found himself sitting with a different question than the one he had been asking for the past week. He had been asking whether Earth was dangerous. The document was asking a different question. It was asking what a species did with its danger, whether it turned it inward and kept paying the cost or found another direction for it. He thought about the fleet outside. He thought about the maintenance personnel reports that had come to his desk that morning, a routine intelligence brief on the human ship's activities during the diplomatic hold. The ships had used the waiting time to run drills, not weapons drills, navigation exercises, emergency repair simulations, the kind of internal training that a force ran when it was preparing to operate in unfamiliar territory and wanted to make sure its people were ready for anything. A fleet preparing to operate in unfamiliar territory, not to conquer it, to operate in it. The language of a force that expected to be somewhere for a long time doing complicated work. He filed the brief and stood at his office window and looked at the star field. When Rhea passed him in the main corridor that afternoon, he stopped. She stopped too. They stood facing each other in the middle of the corridor with staff moving around them on both sides. He said, "The document about your war." "Yes." The middle section, the long part where nothing was clear. She waited. How long did that last? She did not check a number or consult anything. She had it in her directly. For most people who lived through it, about 16 years. For the institutions, longer. Some of them are still in the middle section in ways that are not obvious from the outside. He thought about 16 years. He thought about the HFY's 19-year conflict. He thought about things that lasted longer than they should because the people with the weight to end them found it easier to file the problem in the low-priority queue. He said, "The transparency framework your delegation proposed." "Yes." My staff found 6 points that need revision before it would be workable for Urathi security concerns. "Send them to us," said Rhea. "I will send them today." He moved past her and continued down the corridor and did not look back, because he was a general, and generals did not stand in corridors showing people what they were thinking. But Rhea stood still for a moment after he had gone. She thought about the junior communications officer, Dira, and the fourth cup and hope being heavier than doubt. She thought he was right. She thought the weight of it was the point. Light things did not hold anything together. Outside the station, the fleet was still there, as it had been every day since they arrived. Its crews ran their drills and maintained their ships and waited for the work they had come to do. The stars around them were the same stars they had always been. But the space between those stars was slightly different now, in a way that would take a long time to fully understand and longer still to feel. Something had changed, not loudly and not cleanly, and not in a way that would make a good simple story. Which meant, in all likelihood, that it was real.